And hey everyone, welcome to a special section here in This Week on Russia and the Near Abroad. This lecture is really going to be a little bit of everything. It's a specific examination of the ongoing socio-political developments in Ukraine following the Euromaidan protests of 2014 that not only saw the overthrow of the previous government of Viktor Yanukovich, but resulted in Ukraine's administrative loss of the Crimean Peninsula and the frozen conflict that has arisen in the eastern section, what we call the Donbass region. It is also a specific examination of the so-called Orange Revolution Part 2 in terms of our larger understandings of colored revolutions. And finally, it's really somewhat of a prelude to the guest discussion that I'm going to have this week with Dr. Nikolai Petro, who is going to be giving all of us more of a current series of events within Ukraine and Ukraine's relationship with Russia here in mid-2021. So, this is really the newest addition to this long-standing course, which focuses on really the crisis following, the events in Ukraine from 2014 to 2015, and really helps us take stock of not only Russian foreign policy, but unfortunately, Ukraine's political and economic stalemate. Ukraine has unfortunately really suffered, I think, the most within these last few years as it is trying to, at least among many factions, divorce itself institutionally and structurally from Russia's sphere of influence and try to reattach it to the European Union-centric community. The problem is that the European Union, while offering sympathy to Ukraine, has offered no tangible or discernible roadmaps for ever getting into the organization, much less NATO. So Ukraine finds itself in this limbo, which, as far as Russia is concerned, is more than happy to play the waiting game, wait for apathy and disillusionment with the West to set in before a new leadership emerges and reattaches itself to Russia. The only trouble is that a resurgent sense of Ukraine political identity, which is rooting itself within new political parties, unabashedly and unapologetically anti-Russian political sentiment, plus a newly established independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church that, at least in part, has separated itself from Russia, has made this re-engagement with Russia increasingly difficult, if not impossible. So, here we are effectively in mid-2021. Ukraine is, if I can be overly academic at this point, a hot mess. It's just really internally divided, territorially fragmented, and, the ordinary Ukrainian in the street is, growing disillusioned, I think, by the day, by the false promises and deferred dreams of 2014. So this section, which, as I've said, is really a more of a prelude to the specifics to my conversation with Dr. Petro, is going to examine, as I've said, Ukraine's second colored revolution, the Euromaidan protests of 2014, what is really, Orange Revolution 2.0, following in the footsteps of a previous colored revolution from 2004-2005. We'll be looking at the reasons behind the outbreak of protest, as well as the consequences of regime change that resulted in the ouster of Viktor Yanukovich and the then caretaker government of Petro Poroshenko to where we are today under the current Ukrainian leadership of Volodymyr Zelensky. We will, within that, and it is almost impossible to ignore, the response by Russia. And even more specifically, the response by pro-Russian factions, which certainly will be given a favorable look, if not a blind eye, from Moscow. And certainly among other things is the referendum in Crimea, which went against all kinds of international laws and regulations, but sought to establish, first, independence from Ukraine, the establishment of a Republic of Crimea for one day, and this so-called parastate passed only one constitutional referendum, law, whatever, and that was the desire to annex themselves to Russia or back to Russia, to which, for all intents and purposes, Russia now completely controls the Crimean Peninsula. This was met very closely afterwards by separatism in what we call the Donbass region. It's sort of the eastern regions of Ukraine, which is really more under Russia's sphere of influence than anything else. And this region remains effectively sort of a no man's land controlled by a number of pro-Russian separatists, but certainly not with the leverage that their Crimean counterparts had in breaking away and joining Russia. And then finally, we're going to be examining the specific details of the Minsk Accords. This is the international agreement that was reached by Russia, Ukraine, as well as a number of international participants in trying to find some solution to the Donbass region. And among other things, it acknowledges that the region is part of Ukraine, so it is not going to secede like Crimea, but it will be given a significant degree of autonomy. And here is where the frozen conflict begins, because officials in both Kiev and Moscow have failed to implement their end of the agreement while justifying their stalemate by pointing fingers at the other party for not introducing their own measures. So Ukraine, as I've said, if you really want to, turn this into a very quick TLDR lecture, is a mess. It's a hot mess, and things just don't seem to be resolving themselves anytime soon, and that's the unfortunate reality here. When we examine Ukraine, we are really looking at ultimately three general entities. We have what is effectively the area of most of Ukraine outside of the shaded area here. And, this is by and large part of the sovereign authority coming out of Kiev. Political and social factions within the country since 2014 have been increasingly entrenched between pro-European and pro-Moscow elements. The Republic of Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula, is for all intents and purposes now annexed by Russia. Ukraine's response to both its loss of Crimea as well as the Donbass region has been to economically and diplomatically isolate the regions, which I don't know why they did, because this all but puts them within Russia's sphere of influence. And when we talk about the Donbass region here, this is two general provinces, oblasts, Donetsk and Luhansk. Now, both of these regions are partially under control of pro-Russian separatists. Other areas have been retaken by the Ukrainian government. So what is ultimately the so-called Donbass region is this rump territory that was seized within the conflict here. This is really the area that is now in red. There was an attempt by both, governments in Donetsk and Lugansk to declare themselves independent, very similar to Crimea. So we get the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic, euphemistically just called Novorossiya, New Russia, with the intention of either being recognized as independent states by Russia or just annexing themselves, directly outright. Putin has certainly not been as forceful in this region as he has with Crimea, but pro-Russian militias and military hardware certainly continue to occupy the areas in red, whereas the areas in yellow were previously part of the breakaway region but have been retaken by the Ukrainian army following a ceasefire. So let's, jump back to 2013. To figure out what exactly happened, what led all of this to manifest in Ukraine, which up to that point, was really within Russia's sphere of influence, but increasingly was looking at the European Union as maybe a possible organization to have some association with. And, what gets lost in the specifics is that the then government of Viktor Yanukovych was looking to kind of play both sides. Ukraine was invited to be a member of the Eurasian Customs Union. So it's kind of like Russia's version of the EU, although they just stop at economic regulatory body. So they don't really have any kind of political overtones. But this would effectively be part of an economic organization that allowed for the free trade of goods and services between the respective home country and Russia, as well as other participating members. Now, the European Union has never officially said, let alone hinted, that non-Baltic former members of the Soviet Union have a future in the EU. So what that means, unfortunately, is that the EU's membership will stop once it includes the remaining 5 countries in the Balkans. What does that say for Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, and others? In so many words, sorry, just not going to happen. And, for many of the, Central Asian countries, this was never really an idea. But for a country like Ukraine, right, and to a lesser extent Moldova, but I want to focus on Ukraine, right? Ukraine is vast, but the western areas of Ukraine have more in common with Central and Eastern Europe than the rest of Ukraine does. So when we talk about Ukraine, let me just kind of go back to the map here to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, right? The areas of Western Ukraine, especially, right, Lviv, the areas of Transcarpathia, whatever, this is closer to Hungary, Slovakia, Poland. So if the EU is basically forming a crescent around Western Ukraine, shouldn't Ukraine be part of this organization as well? Especially when one considers that this area of Western Ukraine used to be part of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, the thing with Ukraine is that it's a little bit of everything for whoever it is that wants to look at the country. So Western Ukraine sees themselves as really part of Europe. Eastern Ukraine sees themselves as really part of Russia. And Central Ukraine is just trying to keep everybody, unfortunately, together. So the understanding with Viktor Yanukovych's government is that Ukraine would try to not be a member of both, but somehow be associated with both. So if Ukraine was going to join the Eurasian Customs Union, which made a lot more sense because Ukraine's economic and industrial infrastructure still remains oriented towards Russia, it would make a lot more sense. But could Ukraine maintain some kind of associative partnership with the European Union? And the official answer, so we all got, was no. You have to be one or the other. And so in this case, at least according to Yanukovych, the European Union said to him, and as well as the entire country, if you choose to do Eurasian Customs Union, don't expect any special privileges from the European Union. But at the same time, we can imagine Yanukovych then saying, well, can Ukraine join the EU? And the EU's response was, as it most likely was, we don't know, probably not. We're trying to deal with the Balkans first. So even if there is a possibility, it's not even going to be considered for the next 15, 20 or so years. So Yanukovych makes a decision which ultimately results in public backlash. And that is he rejected EU membership, which is not all that controversial when you think that membership was never offered in the first place. But in so saying that Ukraine would choose the Eurasian Customs Union over the European Union basically meant, and that's especially true to those in Western Ukraine, that the borders are going to remain symbolically, rhetorically closed, right? That there's not going to be any Schengen, there's not going to be any kind of special arrangements. Unfortunately, this is the reality given to him by Brussels. This produces a series of public protests, which doesn't necessarily target the decision so much as it just uses that as a pretext to protest against Yanukovych, largely being, in their eyes, a stooge of Russia, basically a puppet of Vladimir Putin and a supplicant to Moscow. Not only that, Yanukovych represents just one of a slew of Ukrainian politicians and governments that is just endemically corrupt, inept, self-serving, nepotistic, narcissistic, whatever it is that you want to call it. And because Ukraine had at least in terms of their understanding, chose Russia over Europe, this was seen as a pretext for open opposition, beginning with the students. Right? So, cue the checklist of how colored revolutions effectively work. And while it wasn't specifically because Yanukovych rejected the EU so much as it was Yanukovych just shows everybody once again that he is overly dependent on Russia, this produces a series of collective grievances and protests across the country, but primarily within Kiev in the Maidan Square, which is interesting because Maidan is a word for square, for like public marketplace or whatever. So Maidan Square protests in late 2013, early 2014, they all coalesce around collective opposition to Yanukovych, chief of which was, the closing of the, EU talks, even though it never happened, but a list of other grievances. To move the story along, Yanukovych is ousted from power in February of 2014, right? So he just kind of sees that he's got no support. He's lost the legitimacy of the public. This already has its CNN moment, and he steps down from power. Now, this is seen for the first 48 hours as a victory, right? Ukraine is moving towards democracy. It's embracing the West. It's moving away from Russia. It's rejecting populism. All the good, soundbite, clickbait articles that you can expect from the New York Times, Washington Post, Newsweek, Time Magazine, Wall Street Journal, Economist, you name it. After about 2 days or so, and in some cases this began during the protests, there were a number of what we will just call pro-Russian counter-protests, especially in Ukraine's eastern and southern regions, which are populated more by people who identify as Russian. Now here's where things get a little tricky, because up until around 2014, the primary language spoken in Ukraine was Russian, not Ukrainian. Now, is there a difference? Russians will sort of look at Ukrainian as a dialect, sort of a country dialect. Ukrainians will say that Ukrainian is a specific language. Russian is an outsider, Soviet-era language. Right now, most people who live in Ukraine can speak, let alone understand, Russian. But to speak Russian doesn't necessarily make you Russian. So up until 2014, there were a number of people in Ukraine who spoke Russian as the primary language, but still identified as Ukrainian. So what am I trying to say here? Is that up to 2013, 2014, right, Ukraine was by and large a multi-ethnic state in which to be quote-unquote Ukrainian was an all-encompassing set of identities and beliefs. Following 2014, a distinctive ethnocentric understanding of Ukraine worked to differentiate themselves from those who chose to speak Russian as a primary language, but then castigate and portray Russian speakers as Russian, not Ukrainian. What's the problem here? Is differentiating identities and language by political meanings. So these pro-Russian counter-protests, which responded to this overwhelmingly anti-Russian, anti-Moscow, anti-Putin set of demonstrations, felt alienated from the rest of the country. And seeing Yanukovych as their guy that was working to enrich and develop the eastern regions, the more Russian-speaking regions of the country, they saw the changeover in power as a political coup. And so these counter-protests were meant to not only be pro-Yanukovych, but to reject whatever policies and ideologies came out of this Orange Revolution, one of which was, unfortunately, virulent, extreme Ukrainian right-wing nationalism, which basically masked its neo-Nazi ideology with anti-communism and anti-Russian sentiments. Now, that's not to say, and let me state here for the record, this is not to say that those that partook in the Orange Revolution 2.0 were neo-Nazis. Many of them were disgruntled students, ordinary people that just wanted a better life for the country. And in many cases, most of these Ukrainians would have been happy had Ukraine maintained this dual association with both the Eurasian Customs Union and the EU. But when it came to either or, the bulk of the protests against Yanukovych tended to come from those in Ukraine's center to center west. So here, the socio-cultural and the socio-political cleavages begin to rear their heads. Now, once again, the nature of colored revolutions, which we've talked about 2 lectures ago, shows very clearly what had happened in Ukraine. The transitional leadership that ousted Yanukovych and gave us Petro Poroshenko ultimately proved to be nothing more than a transition in leadership, not a system of government. Poroshenko's government started out with overwhelming public support. A few years later, his attempt at rerunning for office resulted in a decisive defeat for the guy. So the support that people had for him quickly evaporated once it became known that he was overwhelmingly corrupt, inept, and largely, if not entirely, dependent on the West. The failure to connect public protests with civic activism also is clear and present. True enough, right? Students, pro-democratic movements, and other people that believed in the cause for making Ukraine a better place were resoundingly disappointed once the Orange Revolution was over, and political leaders and oligarchs, many of whom had been previously in power in Ukraine, but used this as a pretext for coming back into power and authority, began to show very quickly how disillusioned and disinterested many of them were. The reforms, as we talked about, right, almost always target elements of the old regime. So we're not talking about real anti-corruption. We're not talking about ending graft and clientelism. No, we're just getting rid of the current people that are feeding at the trough of corruption because we want to replace them with our own people. So it's just simply playing musical chairs. We're not getting rid of anything institutional or structural. And by the end of 2014, once it becomes known that, improvements in socio-political life does not happen, public dissatisfaction sets in, weak social capital, obviously rears its head. A lot of extremist movements decide to use this element as a way of just breaking Ukraine away from the long-term association with Russia. And, whatever goodwill may have, started out in this protest, quickly turned away. And this has unfortunately been Ukraine's position for the past 6 to, unfortunately, 7 years. Here in mid-2021, Ukraine remains a deeply entrenched country with socio-political cleavages between pro-Western, we can also see them as anti-Russian factions, and what I will just lumpingly put in as Moscow accommodationists. Right? So there are those that want a practical and sensible solution with Russia, and then there are those that want absolutely nothing to do with Russia at all. It is the West, it is pro-America, it's pro-EU, or bust. And, a lot of times within, especially American media, these pro-Western factions, some of them may very well be pro-democratic, pro-European. But a lot of them are also very much ultranationalist, ethnocentric, quasi-authoritarian, but because they're anti-Russian, right, or anti-Soviet, anti-communist, whatever it is you want to, use the term for, they're given kind of a pass within American media because they're seen as just pro-Western. And this is something that is not specific to Ukraine, but something that I should mention, is that there's a lot of movements in the post-communist world, Central, Southeastern, former Soviet Union, that might be called anti-communist, right, or anti-Marxist, anti-socialist, right? But definitely anti-communist is one good example of that. That's a nice way of allowing possibly right-wing, nationalistic, anti-democratic, xenophobic, ethnocentric political movements a free pass. Right? So one can call oneself anti-communist and be seen just as, well, you must obviously be pro-democratic. No, this anti-communist may very well be pro-fascist, right? It's a nice way of saying, sort of neo-Nazi, white supremacist. That's not to suggest that all of Ukraine's pro-Western factions are that, but there's a lot of them that fall underneath the radar by riding with, underneath the coattails of this pro-Western / anti-Russian movement. And so those movements that want some kind of arrangement with Russia, some restoration of some status quo prior to 2014, are going to be seen as just, pro-Russian sellouts or Moscow accommodationists. And, there's very little wiggle room to find some kind of compromise between the two. And this is unfortunately what the current president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, finds himself in. And, his party, Servant of the People, which is named after the television show that he was part of. So, Zelensky is kind of like, he's something like Ukraine's version of a Jon Stewart, or more likely John Oliver. It's probably a better example, right? So he's a comedian who had kind of like one of those quasi-satirical political news shows on TV, who runs for office in the wake of, extreme unpopularity of Petro Poroshenko, wins the presidential election in a landslide victory, like one of the biggest ones out there. But finds himself somehow hamstrung between these political cleavages. So while campaigning, he had promised to get Ukraine out of this frozen conflict. Poroshenko just kind of signed himself on to, pro-Western international forces. But even if Zelensky wants to reach out to Russia, and more specifically Vladimir Putin, that right now risks political suicide from half of his voting constituents. So there's very little that he can unfortunately do, and the unpopularity that Poroshenko experienced is now creeping up, against Zelensky. And, the unfortunate reality here is that the pro-Western factions are really banking on little more than hope from the EU. The linkage and the leverage that we talked about in the first half of class from the European Union, certainly less to even think of NATO, is just not there. There might be some unofficial statements from some members of the EU or NATO that membership should be extended to Ukraine or Georgia, but that's just not going to happen. They are not going to risk the ire of Russia. They're not going to destabilize the region even further by incorporating members of the former Soviet Union. Russia is happy to let the Baltics go, but that's it. So what can the EU really do? What can NATO even do, right? Even less. More to the point, what do the Ukrainian people want? And again, depending upon the news source and where one asks this question, answers might be significantly different. Ukrainians in Western Ukraine are more than happy to basically tell their officials in Kiev, you know what? Get rid of Crimea. Get rid of the Donbass region, basically just cut yourself free from the Russian-speaking electorate and take a smaller Ukraine and one that doesn't have to worry about linkages with Russia and just go full-blown shock therapy into the European Union. Russia wants Crimea, let them have it. They want Donbass, let them have it. But that's a small faction of the people. Politicians are never, ever going to accept the loss of territory, right? It's the same thing with Kosovo with Serbia, Nagorno-Karabakh for, Armenia, let alone Azerbaijan, what have you. So what do the Ukrainian people want, ultimately? It's something I'm going to pose to Nikolai Petro in the next discussion, but suffice to say, they want most likely some accommodation with both the EU and Russia. The understanding is that Russia is the all-pervasive neighbor. It is the country that Ukraine has the closest ties to linguistically, historically, culturally, infrastructurally as well. So, whether or not Ukraine should just get rid of these, economically dilapidated regions is not really the relevant answer. The big thing is, do ordinary Ukrainians just want some kind of accommodation, some working relationship, cooperative relationship with Russia? Politics and politicians be damned in that sense. This is something that we will talk about, I think, in greater specifics with Petro. But let's focus, right? Let's focus on Crimea because, Crimea is I think, the bigger sticking point in Ukraine than Donbass. Donbass is still part of Ukraine's sovereign territory. Crimea is not. So as much as the United States will complain and lament about Ukraine's sovereign violation of territory, the United States did the same thing with Serbia in Kosovo. But the point is that we can talk about Crimea still being part of Ukraine's sovereign control or authority. It doesn't have effective control, right? So, Crimea is lost as far as Ukraine is concerned, and it doesn't seem likely that it's going to get it back anytime soon. Crimea is multi-ethnic and multilinguistic, but it does have a large-speaking Russian majority. And in this case, the Russian speakers of Crimea saw themselves as Russians first, Ukrainians second. It's a big difference between Russian speakers in, we'll just call it the Ukrainian mainland. It's within Russia, it's within Crimea itself that there is a Russian identity because it had been part of Russia since up until 1954. It was in 1954 that the then Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had transferred authority from the Russian SSR to the Ukrainian. Now, because it's part of the Soviet Union, it doesn't really matter, right? It's no big deal here. But when the country breaks up in 1991, Crimea goes with Ukraine. Now, the peninsula had been under some kind of special, as I've mentioned before, institutional autonomy since 1991. But its local leadership, had always had to renegotiate, political and military status with successive governments in Kiev. So, for the people who live there, if this is the arrangement, so be it. For Russian nationalists, it's understood as Russian territory that was unjustly given to another country that now has to somehow work with said country to arrange for its autonomy, for rights that it should ordinarily have. Now, the pro-Western government that came into Kiev following Euromaidan in 2014 was met with fear and intimidation from these pro-Russian communities and saw the new government as detrimental to Crimea's future, especially when it came towards not renewing Russia's naval interests or maybe even eliminating the autonomy, the special arrangements that were part of Crimea. And, this, of course, is exacerbated and certainly stoked by Russia itself, which culminates in about a month after Yanukovych's ouster in February, a referendum on independence, which the Ukrainian government openly condemned, said this was not legal, they don't recognize the results, and they figured it was just going to be some kind of sham rhetorical thing. Well, guess what? The referendum was participated by most of the Russian speakers. Ukrainians and Tatars and non-Russians boycotted the whole referendum, but the results were pretty clear. Overwhelming in favor of independence. That was the whole thing, right? The idea was to vote in a public referendum on independence. People seize control of Crimea, declare themselves an independent state. Russia immediately recognizes the Republic of Crimea. And apparently this so-called parastate, right, has one day to pass one law. and that is a resolution annexing themselves to Russia. It's met with overwhelming approval. The resolution is given to Moscow's hastily appointed diplomat or liaison. Russia sees this as the will of the people and decides, okay, if that's what you want, right, it's part of us. So for all intents and purposes, right, Crimea is de facto controlled by Russia. This, of course, resulted in Ukraine and much of the international community condemning this. Ukraine has blocked off all access to Crimea from the mainland, which just resulted in Russia saying, cool, we'll just build a bridge across those narrow, straits that leads to the Sea of Azov. Now, the Donbass region, a little bit different. Following the resounding success, which meant that nobody expected Russia to do this, sort of Me Too similar moments had taken place in the eastern regions of Ukraine, what we will call the Donbass region, particularly within the oblasts of Donetsk and Luhansk. Luhansk is the Ukrainian name for it, Lugansk is the Russian. Both of these regions are comparatively poor, economically speaking, post-industrial, dilapidated towns and villages, very, very, very different from central and especially western Ukraine. Again, the population is largely Russian-speaking, but to suggest that they identified as Russians and not Ukrainians, here's a little bit more ambiguous because the region had always been part of Ukraine, so there wasn't this sense of injustice of Russia losing territory to Ukraine. However, the region had long felt ignored by Kiev, looked to Yanukovych as, more of a pro-Moscow politician and one who would bring in investments, modernization, some kind of development. The new pro-Western government was all about, Kiev on west. So that meant that the eastern regions were going to atrophy, just completely dilapidate further than, what they were. This, of course, is triggered by some resurgent Ukrainian nationalism, which includes heavy elements of anti-Russian, anti-Soviet, sort of anti-communist sentiment that these Russians had identified with, which puts them under some kind of reactionary leadership of these pro-Russian separatists, militiamen. Certainly they're getting money and ammunition coming from Russia. And this results in a number of do-it-yourself separatist movements occupying all sorts of ministry and military and government buildings in both of these oblasts. This is followed by the blocking of roads with barricades, all under the pretext of counterterrorism. Right? We are defending our region from what we see as neo-Nazism, as fascism coming from the new government in Ukraine. And if we cannot be part of Russia, we will form a new country called Novorossia, right? New Russia, which will include, ideally, this crescent of territory. In fact, if I can go back to the map here, I'll give you a sense of what it is that I'm talking about here, right? This crescent of territory that would begin with Donetsk and Lugansk, but all through southern Ukraine. So this whole region here, which includes the important cities of Mariupol, Kherson, which will then link up with Crimea and create either a new state or eventually annex to Russia itself. Either way, Ukraine stands to lose significant territory or control over territory in the Black Sea. Now, the resulting conflict, which has all the signs of what looks like a separatist war, right? A war of self-determination, very similar to what took place in Abkhazia and South Ossetia for Georgia, Nagorno-Karabakh for Azerbaijan, or the wars of separatism, let's say in the Balkans, particularly within Kosovo, leads to a significant amount of territory coming under the control of these pro-Russian rebels. The Ukrainian counterattack does succeed in taking back a number of towns and cities until a ceasefire is declared, right? The UN calls for a ceasefire, Russia calls for a ceasefire, everyone just basically is like, put your guns down. This is ultimately something that will play into Russia's hand, because what comes out of this ceasefire is what we refer to as the Minsk Protocols. So it's a way for Putin and the then Ukrainian President Poroshenko to somehow come up with at least initial terms of agreement for ending the conflict. Now, those who have taken courses in conflict resolution or have watched some of my videos on conflict resolution realize that ending the conflict is not resolving it. It's just simply stopping the initial fighting. But oftentimes, this necessitates those groups that control certain territory, including towns and cities, to retain control of them for the time being. So it literally is drawing a new line among the current areas of who controls what. So the immediate ceasefire basically calls for the elimination, the reduction of both rebel and Ukrainian military factions from the region. It also calls for the following elements: the decentralization of power of both the Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts to their respective local leaderships, the establishment of a series of security zones that separate the Ukrainian-held and rebel-held lines, so kind of like creating a demilitarized zone that protects the separatists from the home guard, the establishment of local self-government through the coordination of elections between Kiev and the local leadership, and the full economic recovery of the region in coordination with Kiev and Moscow. Now, just by itself here, the Minsk Protocols seem to offer a lifeline to a region that was already economically dilapidated, but then hit with the trauma and the horrors of war. The problem here is that both Kiev and Moscow are holding off on implementing these reforms, accusing the other of not doing something first that would allow their own side to follow suit. So here gets this frozen conflict that just adds more misery to Ukraine's current situation. Now, to be sure, there are pressures on any government in Kiev not to implement these reforms, not to implement anything from the Minsk Protocols, which is understood as, if nothing more, giving power to a region that didn't have it beforehand and is going to be rewarded with, at the absolute least, local autonomy simply by rising up against the legitimate government of the state. Right? So we are rewarding separatists, militants, terrorists with something that they fought for. And in that sense, if that happens, it shows that the government in Kiev, no matter who it happens to be, is weak and is catering to Putin. In addition, if this is something that is going to happen in eastern Ukraine, right, there is always the idea that other areas of the country are going to want the same thing, right? The Transcarpathian region of Western Ukraine, certainly other areas that want to have their own little rights and privileges, right? So this idea of just stonewalling, even though the Poroshenko government signed it, don't implement it because that basically starts signing away elements of Ukrainian sovereignty. So the only thing left is to just engage in total blockage and embargo in the hope of letting the agreement die on the vine and hoping, waiting, anticipating either Washington or Berlin or Brussels or whoever to get Putin to agree to new terms, right? So just kind of stall, let the frozen conflict happen, let the region continue to atrophy, maybe even with the hope that the people within Donbass realize that they're being used as pawns and may try to rise up against the pro-Russian separatists and proclaim their loyalty to Ukraine, right? That's the position from Kiev. Moscow, on the other hand, is dragging their feet, particularly in terms of removing, right, military hardware, weapons, and other resources that give power to these separatists, on the idea that Ukraine has yet to begin the process of demilitarization and negotiation for local elections. So Russia's position is until Kiev reaches out to this local leadership, which it doesn't matter whether they regard that leadership as legit or not, that is the de facto leadership now in Donetsk and Lugansk. Until Ukraine does that, Russia is not going to remove its security element out of fear that this could be a pretext for the Ukrainian army to come in, right, wipe everybody out, cause ethnic cleansing, and retake the region with an enormous amount of refugees and expelled individuals, expelled communities spilling over into Russia. So until Kiev organizes local leadership, supports it, and invests in it, Russia is not going to pull back its own military hardware. This, of course, leads to a tit-for-tat, finger-pointing, tug-of-war situation in which weeks stall into months, months stall into years, years create frozen conflicts. Stalled peace agreements that resemble the diplomatic stalemate surrounding Kosovo, northern Cyprus. And even though Azerbaijan was able to retake about 2/3 of the Nagorno-Karabakh territory, the core pieces of Nagorno-Karabakh remain under ethnic Armenian control. Whether that will be negotiated to go back to Azerbaijan, an independent, autonomous region, all remains up in the air. The same thing with the Donbass region as well. So the Minsk Protocols, which were signed, I think it was 2015, it could even be 2016, I don't remember. I mean, we're now a half a decade out, and the area still remains this, diplomatic, military stalemate. So this leaves us, unfortunately, with a very bleak outlook for Ukraine. Out of, at this point, all of the former Soviet states, Ukraine has been hit the worst. And, just the name Ukraine itself, Ukraina, can be transliterated into on the border, right? It is border territory. It is kind of a gateway between, Europe and the rest of, the Russian hinterland. So, unlike the Caucasus or Central Asia, which, never really had much of a positive outcome to begin with, Ukraine has experienced a significant political and economic downturn since then. And, the current government of, Zelensky is experiencing the same types of rampant corruption and cronyism as they did under Poroshenko and under Yanukovych as well. So, not much has really changed. If Maidan was a transition, it was a rotten transition, very much in tune, unfortunately, with the prescriptive measures of colored revolutions. In addition to that, there is no realistic prospect for Ukraine to join the European Union, and even less so to join NATO. Some, pro-Western, anti-Russian factions want that, right? They want Ukraine to join NATO. It is a way of guaranteeing Russia will never screw with them again. Again, beyond just rhetorical statements, no one is willing to destabilize the region by offering Ukraine or Georgia membership in an organization that is clearly going to antagonize Russia. But even more so, the European Union has this one ace in the hole by just ignoring Ukraine entirely, by saying, Balkans first, you down the road. But since Euro fatigue already shows them dragging their feet when it comes to the Balkans, Ukraine can, understand that they're not even remotely going to be seen as members until the EU brings in, Albania and Macedonia. And because that's God knows when, Ukraine should really give up hope that is, a likely prospect. And so, unfortunately, Ukraine has committed what Petro refers to in a previous writing as economic suicide, right? By hedging its bets that the West is going to step in where Russia will be forced out. It requires detaching the country from Russia's grid. Pipelines, railroads, infrastructure. One example of this is that, Ukraine is still on the Russian pipeline network. Officially, however, Ukraine does not buy 1 cubic meter of Russian gas Instead, the gas is coming from Poland, Romania, or Slovakia. Now, how is this happening? And it sounds almost too bizarre to be true, but the gas will come from Russia, flow through Ukraine, go through Western Ukraine, like let's just say Slovakia, for instance, and then about a kilometer or so into Slovakia, the pipeline will literally U-turn and go back into Ukraine, and that's where the spigot, that's where the faucet happens to come. So Ukrainian politics will pay extra for Slovak gas, even though it's coming from Russia, but to say that it's not Russian gas at all. Obviously, this comes with a markup, and the absurdities are, not lost on, most people here. So economic suicide is the unfortunate cost that Ukraine is paying for detaching itself from, the pre-existing institutional and naturally historical connection that the region has with Russia. Now, this might be less problematic for Ukraine's western regions, but it's devastating for anything east of Kiev. So in this sense, Russia can afford to bide its time, right? Russia would like to come to an agreement with Ukraine over Donbass. But if the climate right now is complete stonewalling and embargo of everything Russian, yeah, it's going to hurt Russia slightly in the economic sense, but it's going to hurt Ukraine even more because Western companies are not going to invest in a country that is politically unstable and which many people regard as will eventually just kind of default back into Russia's sphere of influence anyway. Russia knows this. Putin knows this even more. So can he play the waiting game? He's happy to do so over the past 5 to 6 years. And, unfortunately, the cost falls on largely John Q, Ukrainian taxpayer. But this is, as I've said, really a way to examine the specifics of colored revolutions, the fallout of the Euromaidan protests in Ukraine about 6 or so years ago, and really a prelude to what we will talk about in greater specifics when Nikolai Petro joins us for our final discussion for this week. So I look forward to having you all join us with that one. You're not going to want to miss it. It's always a pleasure to have Dr. Petro speak with us. So stay tuned for the final segment for this week.